And now they see those of us that are espousers of Christ to be a major obstacle. And so, that's why we find that we're being targeted. And understandably, if your primary target and your primary enemy are those that, oppose your agenda, which we do, then you target them in a nefarious way.
Welcome to this episode of the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Sam Johnston, and we got a great show ahead of us. That's such a stupid introduction. Of course we got a great show. What am I going to say? We got a dumb show and you should just turn it off now? No, we got a great show, and we're going to start it off this way with a quote. Let us control your money, and we care not who makes the laws. Now, if you know who said that, comment below, but it's exactly what we're talking about. And Donald Trump so eloquently put it, we're talking about the false song of globalism. So, and we are joined by West Point graduate and Pentagon retiree, Lieutenant Robert Maginnis. Robert Maginnis is the author of The Deeper State, and really the comprehensive guide to understanding what is going on in our government and our world, where we are headed, where we came from, and really why are all these tragedies happening around our world and how they're being used to set us up for something much, much bigger. So, without further ado, Mr. Maginnis, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Sam.
Oh, it is a joy to have you. You did some great work, great interviews over on SkyWatch, and really your book is so great because when we have all these tragedies happening, or really just whenever we talk about the political world, it's always Democrats versus Republicans. It's always liberals versus conservatives, and your book it starts off by just saying, listen, it's not that. It's globalism versus nationalism, and it's like. I've been screaming it for so long, and finally someone wrote a book about it, and it's so nice to be able to hear that. And so for people who don't really understand, what is globalism?
Well, in a secular sense, globalism is free trade, global communication where you can instantly tweet to someone on the other side of the earth, or you can watch them on some cable network. It's about corporate expansion, where you can buy something from China and it can be in your home tomorrow. So these are all parts of globalism, but I would say there's a more sinister piece to globalism. Certainly, it's radical humanism at its core. It's certainly about replacing the nation state, robbing us of our sovereignty. It's about collectivism. It's about denying us of private property in favor of public property. So there are a host of issues associated with globalism that, frankly, a lot of people don't recognize. And of course, the people that really benefit from this are an elite few in the world, people that fuel this corporate expansion, one world government, an idea that, frankly, is propelled by what I call progressivism, something that dates back to a 19th century, actually before that, a German philosopher by the name of Hegel. And then, of course, it was embraced through the ages by the likes of certainly Woodrow Wilson, president near 1917, who introduced the League of Nations, certainly President Roosevelt, the New Deal and all his social programs, and even Obama, all the way up to the president and Hillary Clinton. They're all progressives. They believe that they are genetically predisposed to run the world, that we should bow down. And so these sorts of things do happen. And it's unfortunate that we live in a world where people have lost sight of what this is all about and where we're heading. When I try to tell people they're in the deeper state, there are really three layers of what I'm referring to. The first layer has to do with the political class and the federal bureaucracy. and it's very corrupt. It's sort of an oligarchy. Jimmy Carter, the former president, said, Washington really is an oligarchy. Power resides in the hands of very few. Even Ted Cruz says that you can buy anything in Washington, politicians to boot. And then, of course, the federal bureaucracy. It has its corrupt parts of it. Even here, interestingly, earlier this year, the Federal Bureau of Investigation turned over a report to Jim Comey before he was fired by Trump. And that report said that there were federal bureaucrats that were really creating a sort of revolution of sorts to undermine the president's agenda. And they said that it's very credible. They've had legal counsel, these federal bureaucrats. And of course, they are behind a lot of the leaks, the lies, and the obfuscation. So you have these sorts of things. Now, the second layer, which I delve in great detail in the deeper state, are the four groups of people, the elites of the world, the globalists. You have the very wealthy, the rich, like the David Rockefellers. You have the corporate elites, which fits David Rockefeller, but then you have the political elites like Hillary Clinton. You have the academic elites, certainly Henry Kissinger is classical. And then, of course, you have those that are on the outside, that are in the non-governmental organization types of people like George Soros, who is incredibly wealthy through his manipulation of currencies. And of course, he spins up color revolutions, whether it's in Egypt or in Hungary, or even, I would argue, in the United States through his funding of Antifa and Black Lives Matter and the like. So that's the second layer, and they have great influence over the first layer, the political class and the federal bureaucrats. Now, the third layer, a lot of Washington people deny this, but it's true. And I've spent 50 years in Washington off and on, and I've seen this firsthand. And that's the unseen realm, the occultic, the Luciferians, the moral relativists, the demonic, the witches, and the like. There's an article on the 23rd of May of this year that was published in the Los Angeles Times, a mainstream media, and it was talking about this witch. She wrote it, and she said there are thousands of fellow witches that have cast a spell on Donald Trump, not to harm him physically, but to stop those that would abet his agenda, his effort to destroy the deep state in the federal bureaucracy and the political establishment. So those three layers are very real to me. I've seen them personally. In fact, I live the first level every day because I'm still in the Pentagon and I deal with federal bureaucrats. So I know firsthand, and have for many years, these types of folks. So we live in a very precarious time. I think if you've been watching the news lately, Sam, you probably have heard from the likes of Donna Brazile, who, of course, ran the DNC, Democratic National Committee, during the Hillary Clinton campaign. And Donna says, look, Hillary, manipulated things behind the scenes. And as a result, now poor old Sanders, had no chance from the beginning because Hillary was in charge. And then, of course, John Podesta, if you follow John, he and his brother have stepped aside from their Washington deep-pocketed lobbying firm because they're likely to be indicted by the special counsel, as was Paul Manafort, as will, General Flynn and others. So you've got a lot of deep state stuff going on, and that a lot of it's very nefarious. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to you to see what you have in mind would like to discuss.
Yeah, well, that's a great way to start the show and kind of just a broad overview of what we're talking about. And again, it's always, you name people on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, mixed up in this stuff. And it's so important for us to understand it's not Democrat versus Republican. That's a setup, mind control psyop to make you distracted on what's actually going on. So I love your book for that reason. So let's dive into more specifics on the history of globalism, specifically. Well, I guess starting out, kind of where does the idea of globalism come from, and then how did it seep its way into America?
Well, yeah, the idea of globalism, of course, as I pointed out earlier, is people. It's about power. Mm-hmm. It's about trying to control global markets. Certainly, global governments. We see the emergence of the European Union over the last decades, and that's really a globalist agenda. We've seen the NAFTA and TPT and these other trade organizations, which are really about erasing borders. You see, globalists don't believe in national borders, much less national sovereignty. So if you can erase borders, then you can have a free flow of workforces, immigration. You don't have any taxes per se that inhibit free trade. So all of this, kind of feeds into the corporate desire by deep-pocketed corporations that are multinational to enrich those that own them. Now, of course, at the same time, they have other very progressive agendas. And I pointed out earlier that you had the likes of Hegel and Marx and to a certain degree Lenin. You certainly had Roosevelt and Rockefeller and Obama and so forth. These are all people that categorize themselves really as progressives. They say, well, it's about science evolving, that the social institutions should be getting better each generation. And you had the dialectic idea of of each step along from one generation to another, that the elite that run the place are really improving the whole establishment across the world. So these are all important to understand. But the problem is that in order to do this, they are really fascistic. They tend to be very socialistic. They tend to impose regulations. They want to control the population. The likes of a progressive like Ted Turner says, we only need 500 million people. Now, today we're approaching 8 billion. So they tend to embrace eugenics and manipulation of a host of things so that they're in charge. They want a smaller population. They want the world that is at their beck and call. So all of this is part of a greater scheme. And arguably, these people are not only egotistical and psychopathic, perhaps. I would argue that they are moral relativists in general. And the likes of Hillary Clinton, after all, she's a fan of Saul Alinsky, who wrote a book that was dedicated to Lucifer. And so they tend to be Luciferian, and what I mean by that is essentially that they don't like the laws of God. They want to propel themselves into godlike people. Even George Soros, in his own biography, called himself a god, and he said he acknowledged that his own grandfather was somewhat mad, and he probably said, "Well, I'm probably mad too, a little bit." So you get a sense that not only are they narcissistic and so self-centered and want to control everything, but they in fact are psychopathic to a certain degree. Some of them, in terms of their behaviors. You just watch Hillary Clinton, and I would argue that some of her behavior is psychopathic in that it's antisocial, it's egotistical, it's narcissistic, and all these sorts of things. So you have these groups of people that are very, very well connected, very powerful, manipulative of the world in terms of government, culture, and economy. And it's a scary proposition. And of course, many of them are demonically influence behind the scene, and their association with the evil side of the world, the unseen realm, I think is pretty self-evident.
Definitely. And the theme of apotheosis, which you touched on, is so crucial to understanding why they are doing these things to all these sorts of people. And a lot of people stop at globalization in just a political sense, and they miss out on so many other aspects of it, which you touch on in your book. I mean, there's the religious globalization, the cultural globalization, the educational, the media and communication globalization. It's just so encompassing. And that's the thing, is it's so encompassing that it's hard to you especially touch on in your book, is it's hard to incorporate these ideas because people just will reject them. And you touch on a couple different ways to incorporate these ideas. One is just a straight up war, and you just force it down their throats. And then you talk about the Fabian way and civilization jihad. And so can you expand on those ideas a little bit?
Well, certainly, you have market globalism, you have religious globalism, cultural, social globalism, or social justice globalism. The religious globalism is interesting because Al-Qaeda subscribes to a religious globalism. They want to impose Sharia law across the world, wherever they go. And they have a principle called hijab in the Quran that says, what you do, you evangelize by imposing the will of their God, Allah, on places where you immigrate to. So we've seen this played out very significantly, especially in Western Europe, where you have these ghettos, large and growing ghettos across many Western European countries, where there's a total failure to assimilate. And they don't embrace the language, the culture. They bring in their Middle Eastern, North African, Islamic culture and language and habits and the like, and they impose it upon them. And so they gradually, just like a Dalmatian dog that has spots, those spots come together and eventually they take over entire cultures. And this is the debate today in Western Europe, where you have a lot of people that are really reacting to this. That's why you have the Le Pen. You have the resistance to Angela Merkel. That's why you had Brexit. That's why you have, I argue, what's going on in Spain with the breakaway Barcelona and the province there. You have it in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Austria, and Sweden. So these people are saying, enough's enough. We're losing our sovereignty. We don't have a voice. The European Union, which is, of course, very globalist in its thinking, has tried to impose this, what I say is a tsunami of a refugee invasion with perhaps a couple of million people that have just come in and soaked up social services and have imposed a lifestyle that is rancid with crime and causing these nations to suffer tremendously. So that's part of even the agenda. George Soros is accused by the Prime Minister of Poland, who a couple of years ago was called an Islamophobe because he was opposed to this mass migration. And now you have people even in Brussels at the EU are saying, that he probably had a pretty good idea. He's not xenophobic. He's recognizing that we're losing our culture in Western Europe. And I would argue that's essentially what the likes of the Muslim Brotherhood and some of these other groups would do here in the United States, given the opportunity. Certainly their writings are very, very forthright. They don't make any pretense about what they have as their ultimate goal, and that is domination. They have every intention of dominating once they have the majority. And they're going to insist upon special rights until they get that. And they'll use the education establishment. They'll use the government mechanisms, the courts as best as they can. We've seen a lot of this in Great Britain, certainly in France. We're seeing more of it in Germany. And unfortunately, we're beginning to see even Sharia imposed in certain communities in this country. So all of this is of some consequence, and it's all related to globalism. And it's not just the Islamic communities. You have other communities, and I'm a student of what the Chinese have been doing and how they're expansive it's interesting that President Xi Jinping, who sat through the 19th Congress here a couple weeks back, and he stacked the Politburo with 5 of his lackeys, basically classmates from college. And now they're going to give essentially him the same type of power that the likes of Mao Zedong had. And he's very much a globalist in terms of he wants to gobble up not only the regional power, but global power. He made it very clear. Not only are they a global economic power, but they want to be a global military power. And of course, he wants to eliminate all sorts of barriers. Problematic as it is, he's recruiting many of these so-called globalists that are anti-Christian and, full of themselves, elitists that happen to subscribe to some of his own philosophies. It goes to the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Mm-hmm. And you have globalists that are working with the likes of Vladimir Putin, President Xi, even Khalid Khomeini, who is the Grand Ayatollah in Iran. So there is connection here. And this is a very large and a frightening agenda when you put it all together.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring the Chinese because you can see that their investment specifically into places like Hollywood to try to grasp at the minds of Americans and is really fascinating as they try to grow as the globalist power. And I guess there's a question. Do you think that the globalists have kind of shifted to China because of the election of Donald Trump? Whereas America was the leading front of globalism, now they've kind of shifted over to China because of this opposition they faced?
Well, globalists are going to continue to work in the United States as best as they can. Mm-hmm. Globalists and progressives, I kind of lump together. Hollywood is a captive of progressives, many of which are true globalists as well. Mm-hmm. They believe that the manipulation of media is the opiate of the masses, so they can manipulate the masses through the programming that they produce. And of course, the Chinese recognize the power of culture, and they've bought in, with all their excess funds into not just California and Hollywood, but across the United States. Pardon me. And you see this elsewhere, certainly in Western Europe. They take advantage of whatever they can get in Africa. They manipulate, all sorts of folks in the Middle East, even in India, and so forth. So it is a bit disconcerting. The elites have a very clear, ultimate agenda of controlling the world, and as I certainly go into some depth in the deeper state, I talk about how they coalesce around ideas, and they have their own secret societies that are all not all that secret, except they are very, very exclusive. Mm-hmm. I talk about the Bilderberger group, started in 1954 in a hotel called the Bilderberger there in the Netherlands, and they invite the rich and famous, the most powerful, people that have deep pockets, but also people that are incredibly influential. Those are in political positions, prime ministers, presidents, and the like, and a lot of them have gone. What they do in these secret societies, and it's occultic. When you understand occultic means secret information. And they use these secret meetings that they have because it's closed to the public, and you're supposed to abide by, by the code of silence. You're not allowed to, share what has transpired in these environments. So, some examples. Arguably, the European Union came out of that. Certainly, the euro, the creation of the euro as a currency. Bill Clinton went to Baden-Baden for a Bilderberger in 1992, and that really spun him up, and they sold him on the importance of NAFTA, which really became his economic policy and his major goal, when he was elected president. Of course, they lined up money behind him and media behind him, which got him elected. Look at the Trilateral Commission. They raised up Brzezinski and Dave Rockefeller, took him off to Rockefeller Center when Jimmy Carter was just before he became governor. And he had some great ideas, but Brzezinski, who of course is the Dark Cardinal, served 5 presidents, very closely linked academic to Rockefeller, who served as the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter. But, he kind of mentored Carter, and Carter, became part of the Trilateral Commission, and of course invited all these people, dozens of people that were trilateralists, into his administration. And as a direct result, we ended up with just a classic, I suppose, globalist agenda on the part of Carter. And of course, it ultimately dramatically failed in terms of economic policy. Famously, Carter, from the Oval Office said, he threatened, that we're running out of fuel, so you have to start alternative fuel programs. He said we've about exhausted the world's supply of petroleum by 75%. This was during his administration, frightened people to death. But that was right out of the mouth of the Trilateral Commission, because what they wanted to do is really manipulate and control the world's energy, much like they like to control the world's banks, the world's corporations, certainly health and science. And they have all this influence because they've been smartly preparing the political establishment as well as the economic establishment to really grasp power. And it's ultimately about power and these individuals who seek to be gods in a human domain, and believe that they can do anything. So, these are just examples of things I write about in the deeper state.
It's interesting that we've touched on, one, globalism has to be subtle. 2, it offers this power, this to be like God, which is that mentality is outlined in Genesis 3 of when Satan and Eve interact for the first time. Satan's like, you're going to be like God. He was the most crafty or the most subtle being. So when you tie this idea of globalism into the occult and Satanism, it fits so perfectly with the biblical story that we've already been given. So I think that is such a great point you make in your book.
Yeah, well, as you know, Sam, Nimrod, who was the grandson of Noah, he was, arguably, the first real globalist, because what did he try to do at Babel? He tried to build a tower, and that tower was supposed to reach all the way to heaven, and that was displeasing to God, and so God confused their language and scattered them around the world. Well, of course, we see examples through the ages of people trying to, kind of bring all the power to bear through empires and the like. You think of Daniel 2, and we go through, of course, historically, the first 4 of 5 empires. I'd argue that globalism is really the catalyst to introduce the 5th empire of Daniel, the one that is emerging even now. And that's why in the deeper state, I talk about the imminent final empire, which is really the 5th empire that Daniel speaks about in Daniel 2. And we see evidence of it around the world. They want to control the currency. How are they going to do that? Probably the mark of the beast, something like that. We certainly see that the one world government, and that's that, the idea of the League of Nations, that was the idea that Woodrow Wilson failed to push through the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Senate, but an idea that Franklin Roosevelt took and kind of expanded upon in creating the United Nations, but they're not there quite yet. That's why you have the European Union, you have the African Union, you have organizations, a seed in Southeast Asia, you have others that are emerging. So you want to collapse borders. You want to bring them under one world rule. I was one of the globalists that I spoke with was a professor at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu, and I went there and I interviewed him, and he said, this one world government could easily happen if we have catastrophic events. Now, of course, he's a big climate change person. He says if the climate really goes bad across the world and people are starving, they'll look for a leader. And that kind of fits when I start to think of the Antichrist and the emergence of the Antichrist as sort of a savior. Certainly, if we start seeing the exchange of nuclear weapons around the world, and I do believe the proliferation of nuclear weapons is a real possibility. Look what's going on in North Korea. Look what's going on in Iran. And if we don't bring it into some sort of control, likely Japan, South Korea, Taiwan will all acquire weapons. Certainly India and Pakistan already have them. The Saudis are only a decision away from that. A lot of Western Europeans. So you're seeing the real possibility of a proliferation even accelerating, and therefore the world could be rushed into a very, very dark and dangerous time in which there would be a universal seeking out of a leader that would bring the world to peace. And that's the concept that some people, like this professor, suggested, that catastrophic circumstances make people do things, desperate people do things. And I can see that scenario playing out where, this world leader could emerge from nowhere and all of a sudden, say, I'm here to save you from the likes of these rogue regimes, and I'm going to bring it all together. So, this is all part, I believe, of where globalism is taking us, because I call it a catalyst. It's a catalyst for taking the present chaotic world into the direction of a global world where we have one culture, one economy, and one government. And I see the barriers being knocked down. Now, of course, the emergence of Donald Trump and the emergence of the Brexit effort and so forth may be just hiccups or bumps in the road along that pathway. We'll see in time whether or not this has, real strength to push back and to recover sovereignty. But the progressives in the United States, if you look over the last 100 years, they've made great advances in terms of promoting social programs, socialism, and I would argue Marxism, certainly fascism. And we live in an oligarchy today. The average person really doesn't have a lot of influence over this government. Historically, we've always been off and on sort of an oligarchy, even at the founding of our nation. If you think about it, 55 men wrote and signed the Constitution. Most of them were lawyers. They were bankers. And when they defined themselves, they said that only the virtuous should rule this land. Well, to them, the virtuous were those that owned the land, that owned the money, that had the real control. They did not consider the commoner to be in a position to know how to rule. That sounds not altogether different from what Hegel said in the 19th century. And then, of course, we fast forward, the American people kind of reacted to that under Andrew Jackson in the 30s and the 40s of the 1800s. And they said, no, we want to grab back some of the power. So we found that we had some amendments to the Constitution that gave power back to the people. We found that you had a party system that emerged. And so the oligarchy kind of began to take a back seat. But then, 50, 60 years later, under the likes of Woodrow Wilson and then eventually Roosevelt all the way up to the present day Clinton and Obama, the progressives have reemerged, and they've given us all these social programs, the welfare programs, the Medicare, the Medicaid, the income tax, and all of these things have really revolutionized something that our founders, as flawed as they were, never envisioned for these people. So it's a trying time. Where we're going to go in the future is hard to know, but I see a lot of continuity from what is going on in other countries, and especially in this country, and where it possibly could go, especially as it fits with Scripture, as I pointed out in Daniel. And then, of course, I don't think that we can dismiss, as I certainly don't in the deeper state, the whole spiritual component. I really see it's like the demonic forces, the occultic forces are behind the scenes. You may not see them, but they're there, and they're manipulating. They're certainly influencing these power brokers, these rich elite, and they're using their secret societies and the like to persuade people to go and do things that will advance their personal agenda and also ultimately advance, I think, leading the world to perhaps the emergence of the Antichrist. So it's sort of a catalyst. It's all one big ugly picture moving in that direction.
Absolutely. And again, it's the people miss what the reality of the two sides are. It's not Democrat versus Republican, globalist versus nationalist, or, good versus evil. Just straight up, are you a Christian or are you anti-Christian? And that's the two, the biggest divide that people forget to even think about, which is, again, just a trick by the people in power. I do have to ask, because obviously there's a lot of people that hope that Donald Trump is who he says he is, basically America first, nationalistic mentality, but we still have things like the Trilateral Commission, and we're still in NAFTA. Are you concerned about that?
Well, yeah. Mr. Trump's not immune from the influence of, whether it be the Council for Foreign Relations. He has a number of his people, H.R. McMaster, Ms. Chow, even his trade representative are all CFR members, and CFR has been around since World War I, and it embeds itself through its members in the federal government and consistently from the very beginning, and manipulates, opposes private property, opposes national sovereignty, seeks to remove borders. It does all the globalist stuff. So we have a lot of those folks out there. And I've indicated that the Bilderbergers' reach and influence. They even hired Obama through, just like they did Bill Clinton. And the Trilateral Commission, you have the Bohemian Grove folks and how they gather in California and come up with, some pretty nefarious plans that are made in secret. And I'd argue they violate what's called the Taft Act. In other words, they're making public policy in secret with foreign agents. And that may sound bizarre, but that's exactly what they do when you study what they represent. Or you can look at the Freemasons, you can look at a host of other organizations that bring the rich and famous and powerful together, and they coalesce around ideas that expand their own horizons and so forth. So, it's something that it should not be dismissed. But, when these people look at those of us that are followers of Christ, they're very anti-Christian, very anti-evangelical. They want to destroy our Christian faith influence in culture. They'll give us the freedom of religion, but not the freedom to influence the culture. So we can go meet in our privacy of our churches, but don't talk in the public fora about the claims of Christ. That's what they ultimately want to do. And they're doing that pretty well through the media, through the educational establishment, changing the culture to target Christians and the influence they've had across the world in a very positive way for millennia. And now they see those of us that are espousers of Christ to be a major obstacle. And so, that's why we find that we're being targeted. And understandably, if your primary target and your primary enemy are those that, oppose your agenda, which we do, then you target them in nefarious ways, whether it be by marginalizing what they can say in public about issues like abortion or homosexuality or whatever. And then, of course, you restrict where they can go. You stick inside your church, don't come out and speak out about your views. And we get attacked, by the Southern Poverty Law Center or the ACLU. And they're, of course, all instruments of the left, the progressives that have us in their target.
That's a great point, and I've never really thought about it. Politically, we are, I guess, legislatively, we have freedom of religion, but culturally, we really don't. We're losing it more and more every day, and that's a great way to put it, and I've never thought about it that way. So thank you for that. In your book, you talk a lot about the influence of Darwinism when it comes to globalization. Expand on that.
Well, Darwinism, when you kind of narrow it down to what it really is about, is the survival of the fittest. Now, who are the fittest in civilization? The weak are medically are not going to survive unless you give them special care. So they're eliminated. Those that can't feed themselves are eliminated. This goes back to what I said earlier about Ted Turner and his 500 million cap on the world's population. They certainly want to dictate. They're feudalistic in saying who can live and who must die in such a world. They believe in public property, not private property, except of course their own, and they make allowances for that. And that whole socialism is part of the Marxist agenda. They're very aggressive. They're very I don't know. I've used the term psychopathic in the past. Disturbing behaviors. We find that influence even today in how they want to dominate. By imposing strict rules. You look at the Russians through the history of the last 1,000 years, how they tend to be very dictatorial. When they can't get people to work together, then they just get someone with a heavy hand and put them in charge and force everybody to do what they say. And that's essentially what the globalists want to do. They'll talk democracy and they'll talk human rights, but when you get to the bottom line, they're going to use whatever means necessary in order to manipulate the entire world and to get their own way. Whether the globalists be a Clinton or a George Soros, look at Soros. And Soros, of course, I think he's funded something like 187 non-government organizations to do his dirty work, whether it be abortion, advancement of homosexuality, to undermine biblical teaching, certainly to push open borders and to fund the color revolutions like I think he does through Antifa and Black Lives Matter in the United States, because their intent is chaotic in the destruction of America and what we stand for. So all of these efforts are typically anti-Christian, typically very demonic, I think, in their ultimate objectives. and that power resides in the hands of very few. So, you can easily see that at some future point, this chaotic world in which is emerging, that, we would welcome, because of all the pain and all the suffering and all the warfare and so forth, a king rising in the midst of it, as we anticipate in Revelation. We would see this king rising, this savior that would bring promised peace and tranquility, and would be someone to be respected, someone to bring us closer to God. So deceptive. But yet I can see the scenario that would bring us to that point.
Yeah, every movement has to have some moral justification to it, and theirs is Darwinism, the survival of the fittest. Is I'm the fittest, so you're not, so I'm just gonna trample all over you to get my goals. The ends justify the means, and you spell that out really well in your book. So we talk about the end times coming with Satan ruling essentially as the new world order leader. What policies are in place now that kind of point us to that happening?
Well,
in regards to things like Agenda 21?
Well, yeah. Certainly the United Nations Agenda 21, really is a surrendering of sovereignty at the local level to a bureaucratic organization run by the United Nations. And we find that all over the world. But that's just a seed, and certainly indicative of the type of control that globalists want to have. And the United Nations is just one mechanism. I don't think ultimately the United Nations is going to succeed by itself. It may be one of a number of instruments that ultimately will control most of the work and will coalesce around a future leader. We'll probably have these franchises like the European Union or the United Nations or the African Union and others that will eventually meld together and do away with their boundaries, their borders, and their rules will come together, and they'll kind of point everyone in the same direction. That's what the globalist has in mind. And of course, all of that will be under the control of just a handful of people. That's the scary proposition. And of course, these people will, in their minds, have done away with us pesky Christians and our moral beliefs about God, and then they can be unfettered and accomplish what they ultimately have in mind. Pretty predictable, given what we've seen in the past, all the way back to Adam and Eve and Nimrod, and the disobedience of man, all the way up to the time of the persecution of Christ and today. So, it all kind of makes sense to me, at least.
Yeah, nothing new under the sun for sure. We've seen it many, many times. We're seeing it again. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, as Christians, what can we do about it?
Well, I think first we need to recognize what's going on. Christians need to be involved unfortunately, in the political situation. As I indicated, the three layers, think about it: the political class, the bureaucracy. If the political class were Christians in behavior and not just in word, then we would have a very different type of rulers. And then the bureaucracy would reflect Christian principles. It doesn't mean it would be, I'm not a big fan of dominion and the concept of dominion, but certainly, I think it would be a very different, something more similar to what the founders had in mind. And then we need to recognize that those that influence government, whether it be the average citizen, which doesn't do a lot, but it's the money changers, the people with deep pockets that have something they want done. And I've seen this time and again over my many years here in Washington. So you need to somehow cut their influence off Certainly the NGOs. There are Christian NGOs out there as well, but they're significantly outnumbered by people that are using their academic prowess to persuade members of Congress and administrations that they need to go in the globalist direction, in the progressive direction, and not in the direction according to certainly biblical teaching and the like. So we need to influence those people, that sector, the academic, the NGO world, the lobbyist world, and the like. And then, of course, we need to recognize prayerfully that there's a dimension that we don't physically see with our eyes, but those that are spiritually focused understand that it's a very real realm out there, and that there is evil, and it's very real. And certainly, the people that are self-identify as evil that I've met in Washington have a real influence. They're not just casting spells; they're promoting, abortion. They're promoting homosexuality. They're promoting a progressive agenda that undermines, what we as Christians would aspire for our own nation and for ourselves. And so we need to be involved in all three, prayerfully, aggressively involved for the glory of Christ. If we do that as a people, we're going to inevitably have a great deal of influence. I think that, like in Matthew, we are the salt and we are the light. It doesn't take a lot of us to have significant influence, but we have to be there. And we should not sit back in the comfort of our home and expect someone else to do it when, in fact, God has called us all to be involved in one capacity or another for His kingdom. And that's not just voting, that's speaking out the truth and the like.
Oh, absolutely. Amen. I'm 100% behind you on that. That is so well said. Is you have to be involved locally in your government, locally in your spiritual world, and then even look bigger than that and be involved in all different aspects and facets of things going on. So I think that is so key. Is people love to sit and point out and be like, oh, globalism's taken over the world, so I'm just gonna sit back and not do anything because it's a lost cause anyway. Well, no, you have to get up and actually do something about it. We can change it. The world's not lost yet. Satan's not sitting on the throne of the world yet. So let's step up and take it back for this Christian world and ultimately bring people to Christ and glorify Him in all things. So exactly. So Mr. Maginnis, thank you so much for coming on the Sharpening Report. How can people find you? How can they support you? What have you been doing?
Well, they can certainly read my books. They're available at Amazon and in most bookstores. I have a Facebook page. They can go to it, Robert L. Maginnis, Maginnis. They can kind of follow along there. When I do programs like yours, Sam, I put them up on the Facebook page. And so, that's one way of staying engaged, and just certainly pray that those of us that are out front talking about these issues, espousing the word of Christ in a dark world, that we need to lift them up. There's so many of us, and there's certainly a need for a lot more. And so everyone needs to pray about how God would have them engage, whether in their local community or in their national level through maybe running for Congress or something. Don't limit yourself. God has great plans for you, and there are plenty of opportunities for all of us.
Absolutely. That is, guys, please pick up his book. If you don't understand globalism or its effects on our world, like I said in the beginning, you really need to pick it up and read it, because it has so many quotes by people on both sides, people who understand what globalism is and are pushing their agendas, and the reality of the sinister nature to it is just, in their own words, you can read it. And it's all just a comprehensive guide to understanding the way the world works and why things are happening. So, that is, just go pick it up and go read it. Thank you, Mr. Maginnis, for coming on the Sharpening Report. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Sam.
All right, guys, that's our show for this week. It is another week down. We are halfway through November, heading into Thanksgiving and the holiday season. I'm sure we'll have some great shows about Christmas, and I'll probably ruin that holiday just like I ruined Halloween for you. So that being said, guys, I hope you have a great week. And remember, be involved and be active. Have a good one.